What's up, future saints? How do I become a saint? Well, there's a pretty easy definition that Pope Francis gives us. Being a saint, sanctus, holy. So becoming holy, he gives us this definition. Holiness is an encounter between our weakness and the power of God's grace. I'll say that again. It's so important. That's my favorite definition of holiness. Holiness is an encounter between my weakness and the power of God's grace. So to become a saint, to become holy, I need to know my weakness. I need to know the power of God's grace and who he is, Jesus Christ, my Savior, right? And I need to be open and humble to allowing an encounter between my weakness and the power of God's grace. That's how I become a saint. It's very important to understand that the saints are saints because of that. Not because they have incredible gifts, not because they did tremendous things or were able to do these wonderful visible signs for God. No, that's not why they became saints. They became saints because they knew their weakness. They knew their sinfulness. They knew what they could not do, but they also knew the power of God's grace. And they had more confidence in God and what he could do than in themselves. And they knew that without God, they are nothing. And so they opened themselves up with their weakness, from their poverty, from their brokenness, opened themselves up to the power of God's grace. And as God says to St. Paul, my power is made perfect in weakness. And so the saints are saints because they're weak. And their weakness encounters the power of God's grace. And now they're in the kingdom of heaven. So that's great, because if you're weak like me, that means we have a chance. Sometimes we look at the saints, we're like, oh, they're so awesome. They did so many great things. I could never do that. Well, good news. You don't need to do those things. You just need to be weak. And if you can be weak, you can become a saint. So I think the gospel this Sunday really highlights this well. So let's look at blind Bartimaeus. So blind Bartimaeus knew his weakness. He's blind, and he was begging on the side of the road. Now, what's really cool for us is in the gospel, we zoom into that great moment of healing, but blind Bartimaeus has been blind his whole life. So for his whole life, he's blind, he's begging, he's living this poor existence. And in his suffering and in his affliction, he learns something. He learns that he needs to depend on others and on God for everything. He can do nothing on his own. He can do nothing on his own. He can't see, he can only sit, and he can receive. He can beg and he can receive. He can't do anything on his own. He can't even find food on his own. He has to rely on everyone else for him to survive. And what that has taught him is his utter dependence on God and his need for salvation. And so Bartimaeus, sitting on the road, blind and begging, crying out, we actually see an image of Adam and Eve till Jesus. The whole time that since we sinned, we become blind and broken and dependent, and we're miserable. Our existence is miserable, and we're so in need of salvation. We can't do it on our own. We can't save ourselves. And so Bartimaeus is crying out. He needs God. He knows his weakness. He knows God, and he wants that encounter, and he's crying out for that encounter. And what's so amazing is that Bartimaeus, through his suffering and affliction, he actually comes to understand the mystery of Jesus. That Jesus is not just a healer. He's not just a nice guy that can help out. That Jesus Christ is the Messiah. And here's how we know that. So when Jesus comes to Jericho, he hears that Jesus of Nazareth, that's what they say in the gospel, that Jesus of Nazareth has come to Jericho. And Bartimaeus says, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. Son of David. By calling Jesus the son of David, Bartimaeus is acknowledging that Jesus is the promised heir to the throne of David. Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the one who is sent to save the world. So Bartimaeus, because of his affliction and suffering, because of his yearning, he knows God when he sees him. And so he says, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. And people rebuke him. They're actually rebuked, be quiet, leave him alone. But he cries out all the more. Isn't it amazing that Bartimaeus' life, his whole life could look like an unanswered prayer. For years, for decades, however long he's lived his life, he's been blind and begging God for deliverance. But every day is a new day. And Jesus didn't come to town, and he continues to be blind and begging. And so he could be very discouraged that God doesn't hear him, that God isn't taking care of him, that God doesn't answer his prayer. He could be very discouraged, but he wasn't. He could be very discouraged when these people are literally rebuking him in the streets, like telling him to be quiet. And he doesn't care. He perseveres because he knows his weakness. He knows the power of God's grace, and he wants that encounter. And then Jesus calls him. He calls him. They say, take courage. Jesus is calling you. And here's what he does. So important. He throws aside his cloak. He's blind, remember? The cloak is probably his only possession, his only way to keep warm, his literal security blanket. That's all he has. He throws it aside. He's not getting that back. He can't see. He doesn't know where it goes. But he's throwing aside not only his cloak, he's throwing aside the begging. He's throwing aside his former way of life. He's throwing it all away because he knows Jesus is calling him. And then he springs up. A blind man. He springs up and he goes to Jesus. He's blind. How is he doing this? So much confidence, so much courage. He's blind. He doesn't even know where he's going to land. He can't see his landing, but he springs up and he runs to Jesus. And then Jesus asks him, what do you want me to do for you? And he says, Master, I want to see. And Jesus says to him, your faith has saved you. Not your faith has restored your sight. Not your faith has healed you, but your faith has saved you. That Bartimaeus, in crying out to God in his weakness, not only receives a healing for his physical impairment, but he receives salvation. He receives sanctification. He becomes holy. His weakness has encountered the power of God's grace, and he's not only received strength for his weakness, but he received holiness. And it's so powerful. Jesus says, you can go your way, your faith has saved you. And after restoring his sight, you know where Bartimaeus went? He followed after Jesus along the way. He followed Jesus. That's how he chose. Now let's look at Jesus. Okay, so Bartimaeus, perfect example. Weakness, encountering the powers of God's grace, becoming holy. So let's look at Jesus for a second. How does Jesus approach this situation? Well, first of all, we know Jesus is on his way to the other J city, Jerusalem. He's always on his way to Jerusalem. And this is the final push. He's going to Jerusalem for the final time. He's going to Jerusalem to save us all, to put the sin of the world on his shoulders, to be crucified in love for us, to save our souls, to redeem us, to set us free. But he takes a 20-mile detour. A 20-mile detour. 20-mile detour to Jericho. 20-mile detour to Jericho for one soul. One soul. He goes for one soul. 20 miles out of his way for one soul. Bartimaeus. He knows Bartimaeus has been waiting for him. He knows Bartimaeus has been crying out and yearning for salvation. And so he goes 20 miles out of his way for one soul, Bartimaeus. And then when he comes to Jericho and when he's with Bartimaeus, he could literally just tell him, be healed. We've seen him do that. He could have even healed Bartimaeus from a distance. He could have done it 20 miles away. He's God. But instead, he takes that detour. He goes to the city and he calls Bartimaeus. And then he asks Bartimaeus the question. Bartimaeus is right here in front of him. And he doesn't just say, okay, be healed. He's done that before, rub the eyes, He didn't do that this time. This time he says, what would you like me to do for you? See, Jesus wants relationship. Jesus wants an encounter with us. He doesn't just want to help us and fix us and and restore us. He wants relationship. He wants friendship. And so he asks in the dignity of that moment, he asks him that question. And then Bartimaeus says, Master, I want to see. And then Jesus not only restores his sight, but he gives him salvation. He saves his soul. And that's what Jesus wants for each of us. And that's what Jesus is willing to do for each of us. He loves us as if we're the only one. He will go 20 miles out of his way just for us, just for you. He hears you crying out. He knows your prayer. And look, and even if we've been crying out for a long time, like, yeah, I know my weakness. I've been praying for this for so long. When are you going to deliver me? I know my sin. I know my brokenness. I know my struggle. I know the ways in which I fail to live the life that I'm called to live. And I've been asking Jesus to help me, and he just doesn't seem to help me. Well, remember Bartimaeus. He spent his whole life blind and begging. But what that did was it opened his heart to receive. And as he continued to persevere in prayer, to persevere in yearning, to persevere in crying out, he was able to receive not only healing, but salvation. And when he received the healing and salvation, he followed Jesus and he became a saint. That's what it looks like to me. So if you're crying out right now and you haven't been heard, what's happening is this: God is hearing your prayer and he is giving you the grace you need right now. He is encountering you. Every time we receive the Eucharist, we encounter the power of God's grace and we are made whole again. We are sanctified. We're made holy. But that ultimate healing and that ultimate gift that maybe we're yearning for, that ultimate freedom, hasn't been given to us yet because our heart hasn't stretched open enough to receive the fullness of that gift. So future saints, let's persevere like Bartimaeus. Persevere. And let's we need to acknowledge our weakness and know who God is, the power of his grace in Jesus Christ, our Savior. And we need to humble ourselves and embrace that encounter, especially as we receive the Eucharist. Embrace that encounter. And if we do that, brothers and sisters, we will no longer be just future saints, but actual saints, saints among the saints in the kingdom of heaven.